In the winter of 1867, deep in the isolated mountains of Colorado Territory, something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement of Pine Ridge that would challenge everything the townsfolk believed about faith, science, and the nature of human consciousness itself. A 9-year-old boy named Samuel Henderson spoke words that would save 17 lives. 3 days before anyone knew those lives were in danger. The authorities buried the incident so deep that it took over a century for the truth to surface, hidden in a collection of personal letters discovered in a Denver estate sale in 1973. What you're about to hear isn't just another tale of frontier superstition. It's a documented case that medical experts still can't fully explain, involving a child whose mind seemed to operate beyond the boundaries of normal human perception. The boy's predictions were recorded by no fewer than 43 witnesses, including a traveling physician, who would later stake his entire career on studying this single case. The Colorado Territorial Archives contain depositions from miners, clergy, and even a U.S. Marshal who investigated claims of fraud, only to conclude that something genuinely inexplicable had occurred in that remote mountain community. Before we continue with the story of Samuel Henderson and the mystery that divided Pine Ridge, this channel isn't for everyone. Only for those brave enough to uncover the darkest secrets of American history. If you're ready to explore mysteries that science still can't solve, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments what state you're listening from. Few channels dare to tell the stories we tell here, and if you've made it this far, you're not like most people. Now let's dive into the chilling events that began on a snow-covered Sunday morning in February 1867. The story begins not with Samuel's prophecy, but with the strange circumstances that brought him to Pine Ridge in the first place. Circumstances that would prove far more significant than anyone could have imagined at the time. Pine Ridge stood like a forgotten prayer carved into the Colorado mountains, a settlement of barely 300 souls clinging to survival at 8,000 feet above sea level. The town had sprouted around the Pine Ridge Presbyterian Church in 1864, when Reverend Jonathan Matthews led his congregation west from Missouri, seeking to establish a pure Christian community away from the moral decay they believed was consuming the eastern states. The harsh winters and treacherous mountain passes had isolated them from the outside world for months at a time, creating a tight-knit community where everyone knew everyone else's business, and where faith wasn't just a Sunday obligation, but a daily necessity for survival. The church itself was a modest structure built from local pine and granite, with a bell tower that could be heard echoing through the valleys even in the fiercest storms. Reverend Matthews, a stern but caring man in his 50s, with graying hair and eyes that seemed to see straight through to a person's soul, had built more than just a place of worship. He had created the heart of a community that relied on each other for everything from shared harvests to collective prayers for protection against the mountain's many dangers. The building featured hand-carved pews that Thomas Henderson had crafted himself, each one bearing subtle religious symbols that reflected the deep faith of its makers. The closest significant settlement was Silver Creek, a booming mining town 20 miles down the treacherous mountain road, where men sought their fortunes in silver and often found only death in the unstable mines. The contrast between the two communities couldn't have been starker. While Pine Ridge emphasized moral living and collective salvation, Silver Creek was a place where violence, gambling, and loose morals were as common as the silver dust that coated everything in the town. Many Pine Ridge residents had deliberately chosen their isolated location to escape the corrupting influence of such places, viewing Silver Creek as a necessary evil that provided them with supplies and occasional news from the outside world. The Henderson family had been among the first to follow Reverend Matthews to Pine Ridge, drawn by the promise of a community built on Presbyterian principles and the chance to raise children away from the sinful influences of more populated areas. Thomas Henderson, a skilled carpenter and devoted Presbyterian, had built many of the town's homes with his own hands, including the parsonage where Reverend Matthews lived and the schoolhouse where the town's children learned their letters alongside their scripture. His craftsmanship was evident throughout Pine Ridge, from the intricate woodwork in the church to the sturdy cabins that sheltered families through the brutal mountain winters. Margaret Henderson served as the town's unofficial midwife and herb healer, her knowledge of medicinal plants proving invaluable in a place where the nearest doctor was days away by horseback. She had learned her skills from her grandmother in Missouri, who had passed down generations of knowledge about which plants could ease pain, reduce fever, or help women through difficult births. Margaret's small garden behind the Henderson cabin contained dozens of carefully tended medicinal herbs, and her reputation for healing had spread throughout the region. She often traveled to other settlements to assist with births or treat serious illnesses, carrying her leather satchel of dried herbs and homemade tinctures. The Hendersons had struggled for years to have children of their own, a source of deep pain in a community that viewed large families as a sign of God's blessing. Margaret had suffered 3 miscarriages in their early years of marriage, each loss deepening their sense that perhaps God had different plans for their lives. They had prayed constantly for a child, and when that child finally came into their lives, the circumstances were so unusual that many in the community saw it as a direct answer to their prayers. It was in the spring of 1858 that their prayers seemed answered, when Thomas found an infant boy abandoned near the ruins of a burned Ute settlement about 5 miles from Pine Ridge. But the true story of Samuel's discovery was far more complex and disturbing than the simple tale of an abandoned child that the Hendersons told their neighbors. Thomas had been hunting deer in the dense pine forests that surrounded their settlement, following game trails that led him farther from home than he usually ventured. The area where he found the child had been the site of what appeared to be a small Ute family camp, but the scene that greeted him was one of devastating violence. 3 adult bodies lay scattered around the burned remains of a traditional shelter, their corpses bearing evidence of gunshot wounds and knife cuts. Personal belongings were scattered everywhere, jewelry, tools, and religious items that spoke of a family that had been in the middle of their daily routines when death came calling. The infant boy had been hidden in a carefully constructed root cellar beneath the main shelter, wrapped in a buffalo hide blanket that had protected him from both the fire above and the cold mountain air. But Thomas quickly realized that this was no newborn. The child appeared to be at least 18 months old enough to walk and speak simple words. The boy's survival suggested that someone had hidden him deliberately, taking the time to ensure his safety even as violence raged above. More disturbing still were the signs that this had not been a random attack. The bodies showed evidence of torture, and the systematic destruction of the camp suggested that the attackers had been searching for something specific. Thomas found evidence of digging around the camp, as if the killers had believed treasure was buried there. Later investigation would reveal that the site was considered sacred by local Ute bands, a place where medicine men came to conduct vision quests and communicate with ancestral spirits. Thomas made a decision that would haunt him for years to come. Instead of reporting the massacre to the territorial authorities, he took the child and buried the bodies himself, creating simple grave markers that he hoped would provide some dignity for the dead. His reasoning was partly practical. The nearest territorial marshal was over 100 miles away, and by the time help arrived, any trail left by the killers would be long cold. But he was also motivated by a deeper understanding of the tensions between white settlers and Native Americans, tensions that might have made life dangerous for any white family known to be raising an Indian child. The Hendersons presented Samuel to their community as an abandoned infant they had found during a hunting trip, and the boy's obvious need for care made their neighbors more sympathetic than suspicious. In a frontier community where death was common and orphaned children needed homes, the adoption seemed like a natural act of Christian charity. Samuel was baptized in Pine Ridge Presbyterian Church 2 weeks after his arrival, with Reverend Matthews declaring that God had clearly intended for the boy to be raised in a Christian household. But Samuel's true origins left their mark on him in ways that wouldn't become apparent for years. The trauma of losing his birth family, combined with whatever he had witnessed during those terrible hours in the root cellar, had created deep psychological scars that manifested in unusual ways. He suffered from nightmares that left him screaming in a language that Margaret didn't recognize, and he often seemed to be listening to sounds that no one else could hear. Samuel grew into a serious boy with dark hair and unusually pale green eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. He was small for his age, but possessed an uncanny ability to sense changes in weather, often warning his adoptive parents of approaching storms hours before clouds appeared. The other children found him strange but not unfriendly, and he had a particular gift for finding lost items, a skill that had made him popular among the town's adults. Mrs. Henderson often joked that Samuel had been blessed with spiritual sight, though she never imagined how literally prophetic those words would prove to be. As Samuel grew older, his unusual abilities became more pronounced. He could predict which of Margaret's pregnant patients would have difficult births, and his warnings allowed her to prepare the herbs and equipment needed for complicated deliveries. He seemed to know instinctively which wild animals were dangerous and which were safe to approach, a knowledge that kept him safe during his solitary explorations of the mountain forests. Most remarkably, he could sense when someone in the community was seriously ill, often appearing at their door with Margaret's medicine bag before she had even been summoned. These abilities earned Samuel a reputation as a special child, but they also created a certain distance between him and the other children in Pine Ridge. Parents appreciated his help, but were sometimes unsettled by his intense gaze and his tendency to know things he shouldn't. Samuel seemed aware of this distance and became increasingly withdrawn as he grew older, spending more time alone in the forests around Pine Ridge, where he felt most comfortable. The winter of 1867 had been particularly harsh, with snow falling almost continuously since November. The community had been cut off from Silver Creek for over 2 months, relying on stored provisions and the occasional successful hunting trip. It was during this period of isolation and hardship that the strange tensions in Samuel's background would finally surface in a way that would change everything. February 18th, 1867, dawned clear and bitter cold, with temperatures well below freezing and a wind that cut through the thickest wool like a blade. The night before had brought one of those profound silences that only occur in deep winter at high altitude, when the cold is so intense that even the usual night sounds of the forest are muffled into submission. Thomas Henderson had noticed Samuel's restlessness during the previous evening, the boy pacing their small cabin and staring out at the star-filled sky with an intensity that reminded Margaret of his worst nightmares from early childhood. The Sunday morning service at Pine Ridge Presbyterian had drawn nearly the entire community, as it always did during the harsh winter months when collective warmth and shared faith provided comfort against the mountain's relentless hostility. The small church was packed beyond its normal capacity, with 47 adults and 16 children crowded into pews designed for a smaller congregation. The air inside was thick with the scent of wool clothing, wood smoke from the pot-bellied stove, and the lingering aroma of the pine pitch that Thomas Henderson had used to seal the windows against winter drafts. Reverend Matthews had been delivering a sermon about Job's trials, drawing parallels between the biblical patriarch's sufferings and the hardships faced by their own mountain community. His voice carried the authority of a man who had led his flock through genuine hardship, and his words resonated with people who understood intimately the challenges of maintaining faith in the face of isolation, danger, and material deprivation. The congregation listened with the focused attention of people for whom such sermons weren't merely theological exercises, but practical guidance for daily survival. Samuel Henderson sat in the third pew with his adoptive parents, his pale green eyes fixed on Reverend Matthews with an intensity that several observers would later remember as unusual even for him. Margaret had noticed that morning that Samuel seemed different, more alert and focused than normal, but also somehow distant, as if part of his attention was turned towards something only he could perceive. She had attributed his strange mood to the restless night he had spent. But as the service progressed, she began to sense that something more significant was happening. It was during Reverend Matthew's discussion of Job's faith in the face of inexplicable suffering that Samuel suddenly stood up, his movement so abrupt and unexpected that the wooden pew creaked loudly in the otherwise silent church. But these weren't the confused movements of a child disrupting a service. Samuel rose with a strange dignity and authority that seemed to transform him before the congregation's eyes. "The earth trembles beneath Silver Creek," Samuel said in a voice that seemed to carry an otherworldly authority, his pale green eyes staring straight ahead, as if looking through the church walls into some distant vision. The words came out clearly and precisely, each syllable articulated with a gravity that no 9-year-old should have possessed. "The number 17 shall be spared by the warning of the crow. When the sun reaches its highest point on the 3rd day hence, the mountain shall swallow the greedy, and the silver shall run red with blood." The congregation fell into the kind of profound silence that seems to have weight and substance, broken only by the crackling of wood in the stove and the distant howling of wind through the pine trees outside. Every person in that church would later remember the exact quality of Samuel's voice during those moments, how it seemed to carry harmonics that resonated in their chests, how it commanded attention in a way that bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to some deeper part of their minds. Samuel continued, his voice taking on a strange cadence that seemed to blend English with sounds that reminded some of the older settlers of the native tongues they'd heard from Ute traders in years past. "Kokopeli Kina, Machetu Wembe. The old spirits remember the sacred places where blood was spilled. 17 souls walking in darkness, but the crow brings light to the shadow places where silver men dig their graves." Margaret Henderson reached instinctively for her son, her motherly concern overriding her amazement at his transformed presence. But Samuel stepped away from her touch as if he couldn't see her, his eyes maintaining their fixed stare toward the front of the church. His body had taken on a rigidity that seemed almost cataleptic, and his breathing had become slow and deep, as if he were in some kind of trance state. The boy's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the church, each word seeming to hang in the air with supernatural clarity. Tell the men of the deep places, when the sun stands still in the sky on Wednesday, let no man go beneath the earth. The mountain is hungry, and it remembers the blood that was spilled in the sacred place. It will feed on the children of those who disturbed the sleeping spirits." Then Samuel spoke words that would be remembered and debated for generations. "Wembe natai kishkai." The mountain spirits speak through the child who was born in shadow and raised in light. But the gift comes with a price. Each vision tears a piece from the seer's soul, and the mountain grows hungry for more. Beware, for what was taken from the sacred place will be reclaimed, and the debt will be paid in silver and bone. As suddenly as it had begun, the episode ended. Samuel blinked several times, looked around the church with genuine confusion at all the staring faces, and asked his mother in his normal 9-year-old voice why everyone was looking at him so strangely. He had no memory of what had just occurred, and his immediate concern was whether he had done something wrong to upset the congregation. The reaction was immediate and powerfully divided. Elder Marcus Blackwood, a harsh man in his 60s who had appointed himself the community's moral guardian, stood up and pointed an accusatory finger at Samuel. "That boy speaks with the tongue of heathens," he declared, his voice shaking with either fear or rage. "No Christian child knows such words unless he has been corrupted by savage influences. We must cast out this evil before it spreads to our own children." But Sarah Denton, whose brother worked in the Silver Creek mines, felt a chill of recognition at Samuel's words. She had heard her brother describe the dangerous conditions in the mines, the constant threat of cave-ins and explosions that made every shift a gamble with death. Samuel's warning about Wednesday, that was the day the mines always resumed full operations after their monthly safety inspection. If there was even a chance that the boy's words carried truth, Reverend Matthews, shaken to his core by what he had witnessed, tried to maintain order while wrestling with theological questions that had no easy answers. Was this divine revelation speaking through an innocent child, or was it something darker and more dangerous? The boy's use of what appeared to be Native American words troubled him deeply, especially given the persistent rumors about Samuel's true origins that had circulated quietly through the community for years. Old Willem Strauss, who had spent 40 years in mining camps throughout the Colorado Territory, felt a different kind of recognition stirring in his memory. Some of the words Samuel had used sounded familiar, fragments of Ute language he had learned during his early days in the territory. The boy had spoken of the sacred place where blood was spilled, and Willem knew of such places. Sites where conflicts between miners and Native Americans had left lasting scars on the landscape and, according to Ute beliefs, on the spiritual realm as well. Dr. Ezra Keller, a traveling physician who had arrived in Pine Ridge the previous day to treat an outbreak of winter fever, observed the proceedings with the trained eye of a man who had seen various forms of mental disturbance. But Samuel's episode didn't fit any of the patterns he recognized from his medical training. The boy's speech had been too coherent and purposeful for a seizure disorder, too specific for hysteria, and too controlled for the kind of religious mania that sometimes affected frontier communities. The congregation slowly dispersed after Reverend Matthews offered a closing prayer that asked for divine guidance in understanding what they had witnessed. But the conversations continued long into the night, with neighbors visiting each other's cabins to discuss the implications of Samuel's prophecy. Some saw it as a divine warning that must be heeded at all costs. Others viewed it as evidence of demonic influence that threatened the spiritual safety of their entire community. Still others searched for rational explanations. Perhaps the boy had overheard adult conversations about mining dangers, and his imagination had transformed that knowledge into prophecy. Thomas Henderson, embarrassed and deeply concerned about his family's standing in the community, took Samuel home immediately after the service. The rest of Sunday was spent in tense discussion among the townspeople, with opinions ranging from calling for the boy's immediate removal from the community to organizing a prayer vigil for his spiritual protection. The more practical residents dismissed the incident as a child's imagination running wild, influenced by too many Bible stories and frontier legends. But 3 people in that church knew Samuel's words carried weight beyond mere childhood fantasy. Jacob Miller, who ran the general store and maintained contacts with Silver Creek through occasional trading expeditions, remembered that Wednesday was February 21st. The day the Silver Creek mine typically resumed operations after their monthly safety inspection. Sarah Denton had been expecting her brother William to visit Pine Ridge that very Wednesday, bringing supplies and news from the mining town. And Willem Strauss recognized in Samuel's words the kind of geological warnings that old-timers had learned to respect, even when they came from unexpected sources. These 3 individuals made a decision that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They chose to wait and see if the boy's words would prove prophetic, treating Samuel's vision as a test of faith rather than a warning to be heeded immediately. None of them sent word to Silver Creek about the strange prophecy. They wanted to see if God would truly speak through a child, or if the incident had been nothing more than an overwrought imagination combined with unconsciously absorbed adult knowledge. The 3 days that followed Samuel's disturbing prophecy passed with the kind of agonizing slowness that makes minutes feel like hours and hours like days. The boy himself seemed completely normal during this period, playing with the other children when weather permitted and helping his adoptive mother with household chores. He showed no signs of remembering his episode in church, and when his parents gently questioned him about it, he looked at them with genuine confusion that seemed impossible to fake. Margaret Henderson found herself watching Samuel constantly during those days, searching for any sign that another episode might be coming. She noticed small things that perhaps only a mother would observe. The way he sometimes paused in the middle of playing to stare toward the south, where Silver Creek lay hidden beyond the mountain ridges. How he seemed unusually sensitive to sounds, often asking her if she had heard something when she heard nothing at all. Most troubling of all was his increasing restlessness as Wednesday approached, a nervous energy that reminded her of how animals behaved before severe storms. However, the adults of Pine Ridge were far from normal during this waiting period. The community had fractured along lines that revealed deeper tensions about faith, reason, and the proper response to the unexplained. The most vocal faction, led by Elder Marcus Blackwood, had become convinced that Samuel represented a spiritual threat to their community. They pointed to his mysterious origins, his strange abilities, and now his use of what they believed to be heathen language, as evidence that he had been corrupted by dark influences. Blackwood spent hours each day visiting different families, building support for his belief that Samuel should be removed from Pine Ridge for the safety of the other children. He cited biblical passages about false prophets and the dangers of allowing evil to take root in a Christian community. His arguments were particularly persuasive to parents who had noticed their own children's fascination with Samuel's unusual abilities and worried about the influence he might have on their spiritual development. A smaller but equally passionate group, led by several of the town's women including Sarah Denton and Martha Caldwell, saw Samuel as a vessel for divine revelation. They formed prayer circles that met in secret, asking God to protect the boy and to help the community understand the meaning of his prophecy. These women had been most affected by Samuel's obvious distress during his episode, seeing in him not a threat, but a child who needed their protection and support. Martha Caldwell, whose own son had died in a mining accident 3 years earlier, was particularly vocal in defending Samuel. She argued that God often spoke through children and innocents, citing numerous biblical examples. Her passionate defense of the boy was partly motivated by her own grief and her desperate hope that perhaps divine intervention could prevent other families from experiencing the loss she had endured. The majority of the townspeople found themselves caught between these extremes, uncertain what to believe but unwilling to dismiss the incident entirely. The isolation of their mountain community had made them acutely aware of their dependence on each other and on forces beyond their control. In such an environment, the possibility of prophecy seemed less absurd than it might have in a more connected modern setting. Dr. Ezra Keller, the traveling physician, had extended his stay in Pine Ridge partly out of medical curiosity about Samuel's condition, and partly because the winter weather made travel dangerous. He spent considerable time observing the boy, looking for signs of epilepsy, hysteria, or other conditions that might explain his unusual episode. But Samuel appeared to be in perfect health, showing none of the telltale signs of neurological disorder that Keller had learned to recognize during his medical training. Keller's observations did reveal some interesting details about Samuel's background. The boy showed unusual knowledge of plant medicines and natural remedies, often helping his adoptive mother prepare treatments for sick neighbors. He possessed an uncanny ability to predict weather changes, often warning of storms hours before they arrived. Most intriguingly, he seemed to have an instinctive understanding of human nature, often knowing when adults were upset or worried even when they tried to hide their emotions. Reverend Matthews spent those 3 days in intense prayer and contemplation, studying his Bible for guidance on how to handle what might be divine revelation or demonic deception. He visited the Henderson family each day, observing Samuel carefully for any signs of spiritual disturbance or unusual behavior. The boy seemed utterly ordinary during these visits, perhaps quieter than usual, as if sensing the tension around him, but showing no trace of the otherworldly presence that had manifested in church. The Reverend's theological training had not prepared him for a situation like this. Presbyterian doctrine emphasized the importance of Scripture and reason in spiritual matters, but it also acknowledged that God could work in mysterious ways. Matthews found himself torn between his intellectual skepticism and his growing sense that something genuinely supernatural might be occurring in his community. Thomas Henderson, meanwhile, had begun his own quiet investigation into Samuel's prophecy and its possible meanings. He was a practical man who preferred facts to speculation, and he decided to learn more about the circumstances of Samuel's discovery and the history of the area where the boy had been found. This investigation would prove far more revealing than he had expected. Through careful questioning of older residents and traders who had known the area before Pine Ridge's establishment, Thomas began to piece together a more complete picture of the site where Samuel had been discovered. The location had been known to local Ute bands as a sacred place where their medicine men went to seek visions and commune with ancestral spirits. The small family group that had been killed there had not been random travelers, but rather guardians of the site, people who had been entrusted with maintaining its spiritual significance. The attack that had destroyed Samuel's birth family had been carried out by a group of prospectors who believed the Native Americans were hiding gold or silver in the area. Local rumors suggested that these men had tortured their victims, trying to force them to reveal the location of imaginary treasure. When no treasure was found, the prospectors had killed everyone and burned the camp to cover their tracks. Only Samuel had survived, hidden in the root cellar by someone who had given their life to protect him. This information cast Samuel's prophecy in a different and more troubling light. The boy's warnings about Silver Creek might not be supernatural at all, but rather some kind of inherited memory or unconscious knowledge passed down from his birth family. Thomas had heard stories of how Native American children were taught from infancy to read the signs of the natural world, to understand the language of animals and the moods of the earth itself. But Thomas's growing rational explanation for his son's behavior would prove inadequate when he learned more about the specific site where Samuel had been found. The location was not just any sacred place, but rather a site specifically associated with prophecy and vision-seeking. According to Ute tradition, children born at such sites often possessed unusual abilities, gifts that allowed them to see beyond the normal boundaries of time and space. More disturbing still was what Thomas learned about the timing of the attack that had orphaned Samuel. It had occurred in late spring of 1858, just as several mining claims in the Silver Creek area were being established. The prospectors who had killed Samuel's family had been working for investors who would later become the owners of the Silver Creek mine. The connection between Samuel's traumatic past and his prophecy about mining disaster seemed too specific to be mere coincidence. As Wednesday morning approached, Thomas found himself facing an impossible decision. Should he trust in his son's supernatural gift and send a warning to Silver Creek, risking ridicule and potentially dangerous accusations of fraud? Or should he maintain silence and hope that the boy's words had been nothing more than the product of an overwrought imagination combined with unconsciously absorbed knowledge about mining dangers? The decision would ultimately be taken out of his hands by events that none of them could have predicted. Wednesday, February 21st, 1867, dawned with the kind of pristine mountain clarity that made distant peaks seem close enough to touch, and every sound carry for miles through the thin air. The sun climbed steadily through a cloudless sky, creating exactly the kind of perfect stillness Samuel had described when he spoke of the sun standing still in the sky. As the morning progressed, several Pine Ridge residents found themselves checking their pocket watches obsessively, calculating when the sun would reach its highest point and wondering if they were about to witness the fulfillment of a 9-year-old boy's impossible prophecy. Jacob Miller had spent the most restless night of his life, torn between his practical nature and a growing conviction that Samuel's warning needed to be taken seriously. The storekeeper had built his reputation on careful judgment and measured responses to crisis, but something about the boy's prophecy had shaken his usual confidence. He found himself standing in his store as dawn broke, staring toward the mountain path that led to Silver Creek and wrestling with a decision that seemed to have no clearly right answer. Miller's practical concerns were numerous and valid. The 20-mile journey to Silver Creek was dangerous even in good weather, requiring travel over narrow mountain passes where a single misstep could send horse and rider plummeting into ravines, hundreds of feet deep. The recent heavy snows had made the path even more treacherous, and Miller knew that attempting the journey alone would be foolhardy. But sending someone else to deliver a warning based on a child's vision seemed equally irresponsible, especially if that person was injured or killed making the attempt. More troubling still were the potential consequences of interfering with Silver Creek's mining operations. The mine was owned by the Denver Silver Company, a powerful organization with connections to territorial government and federal mining interests. False warnings about mine safety could be interpreted as sabotage or fraud, carrying legal penalties that could destroy not just Miller, but the entire Pine Ridge community. If Samuel's prophecy proved false, the backlash could drive them from their mountain home forever. But Miller also remembered his own experiences in mining country, the sudden collapses and explosions that could kill dozens of men in seconds. He had lost friends to such disasters and had learned to respect any warning, no matter how unlikely its source. As the morning sun climbed higher, his sense of responsibility for the lives that might be lost began to outweigh his concerns about the risks of action. Sarah Denton faced an even more personal dilemma. Her brother William worked as a shift foreman at the Silver Creek mine, and she knew he would be underground that Wednesday, leading the first full crew back into the depths after their monthly safety inspection. She had written him a letter 4 different times, trying to find words that would warn him without making her sound like a woman driven mad by frontier isolation and religious hysteria. Each attempt had ended in frustration. How could she explain that a 9-year-old boy had prophesied disaster during a church service? How could she describe Samuel's use of what sounded like Native American words without raising questions about his origins that might endanger the Henderson family? And how could she ask her brother to risk his job and reputation by halting mining operations based on the visions of a child he had never met? Sarah's internal struggle was complicated by her own growing belief in Samuel's gift. She had watched the boy for years, noting his uncanny ability to predict weather changes and sense when people in the community were ill or in distress. She had seen him find lost items in places where no one else had thought to look, and she had witnessed his almost supernatural understanding of animal behavior and natural phenomena. If Samuel truly possessed some kind of prophetic ability, then her brother's life might depend on whether she could find the courage to act on that belief. Old Willem Strauss, however, had already made his decision. The 73-year-old prospector had survived cave-ins in Pennsylvania, Colorado, and Nevada by learning to trust his instincts about underground dangers, even when those instincts seemed to contradict practical logic. Something about Samuel's prophecy had resonated with his decades of mining experience, triggering warning bells that he had learned never to ignore. Willem had spent the night preparing for what he knew would be the most dangerous journey of his life. His arthritis made mounting a horse painful, and his aging eyes made navigating treacherous mountain paths risky even in good conditions. But he had loaded his saddlebags with emergency supplies and written letters to be delivered to his relatives in case he didn't return. By dawn, he was ready to attempt what Miller and Sarah Denton had only considered, a desperate race to Silver Creek to deliver a warning that might save lives, or might mark him as a dangerous madman. The old prospector set out from Pine Ridge just as the sun cleared the eastern peaks, riding his sturdy mountain horse along the narrow trail that wound through pine forests and across precipitous passes. The path was treacherous under the best conditions, requiring constant attention to avoid loose rocks, hidden ice patches, and sections where winter storms had washed away portions of the trail entirely. Willem knew he was racing against time in more ways than one. Not only did he need to reach Silver Creek before Samuel's predicted noon disaster, but he also needed to arrive early enough to convince the mine supervisors to take his warning seriously. The journey normally took 6 hours in good weather, but the recent snows and Willem's own physical limitations made the trip even more challenging. His horse, a reliable mare named Constance, who had carried him through many dangerous situations, seemed to sense the urgency of their mission and picked her way carefully but steadily along the treacherous path. Meanwhile, back in Pine Ridge, Samuel Henderson was experiencing something that would later be described in medical journals as post-episodic anxiety. Though he had no conscious memory of his prophecy, his body seemed to remember the stress and trauma of the event. He was restless and irritable, unable to concentrate on his usual activities and asking his mother repeatedly about the time. Margaret Henderson found herself torn between comforting her son and fighting her own growing dread about what the day might bring. Samuel's behavior during those morning hours was observed by several neighbors who would later provide detailed accounts to investigators. Mrs. Agnes Caldwell noted that the boy seemed to be listening to sounds that no one else could hear, often pausing in his activities to cock his head toward the south, where Silver Creek lay hidden beyond the mountain ridges. Dr. Keller observed that Samuel's pupils were dilated and his pulse elevated, symptoms that might indicate either illness or extreme stress. Most unsettling of all was Samuel's increasing verbalization of his anxiety. Though he couldn't remember his prophecy, he began speaking about the men in the dark places and expressing worry about people he claimed to see in his mind. "They're going too deep," he told his mother during the late morning hours. "The mountain doesn't want them there. Something bad is waiting in the deep places." Margaret Henderson tried to calm her son with household tasks and familiar routines, but Samuel seemed incapable of focusing on anything except his mysterious concerns about unknown people in underground locations. His distress was so obvious that several neighbors stopped by the Henderson cabin to check on the family, creating an impromptu gathering of worried adults, trying to comfort a child whose fears they couldn't understand or address. The rest of the Pine Ridge community went about their daily activities with forced normalcy, but an undercurrent of tension ran through every conversation and interaction. Children were kept closer to home than usual, as if their parents feared that whatever had affected Samuel might be contagious. Men checked their tools and supplies more carefully than necessary, as if preparing for some undefined emergency. Women gathered in small groups, ostensibly for quilting or cooking, but actually to share their fears and speculations about what the day might bring. Dr. Keller spent the morning making detailed observations of the community's collective state of mind, noting how a single unexplained event had created ripple effects throughout the social fabric of Pine Ridge. His medical training had taught him about mass hysteria and collective delusions. But what he observed in Pine Ridge didn't fit those patterns. Rather than feeding on each other's fears, the community members seemed to be struggling individually with questions about faith, reason, and the nature of reality itself. As the sun climbed toward its zenith, even the most skeptical residents found themselves glancing frequently toward the south and listening for sounds that might carry news from Silver Creek. The normal activities of the settlement, children playing, axes chopping wood, the blacksmith's hammer ringing against heated metal, seemed muted and distant. A strange quiet had settled over Pine Ridge, as if the entire community was holding its breath and waiting for something that none of them could clearly define. At exactly 23 minutes past noon, according to Thomas Henderson's carefully calibrated pocket watch, the earth moved. It wasn't a traditional earthquake. The residents of Pine Ridge had experienced those before, and they knew the rolling, wave-like motion of true seismic activity. This was different. A sudden, sharp jolt that seemed to come from deep underground, followed by a low rumble that echoed through the mountains for nearly 30 seconds. Windows rattled in their frames, dishes fell from shelves, and several people were knocked off their feet, but no significant structural damage occurred in Pine Ridge itself. The sound, however, was unmistakable to anyone who had spent time in mining country. It was the sound of a mountain falling in on itself, of millions of tons of rock and earth shifting suddenly into spaces that had been carved out by human hands. It was the sound of a mine collapse, and it had come from the direction of Silver Creek. Samuel Henderson, who had been pacing restlessly around his family's cabin all morning, suddenly stopped moving and stood perfectly still for nearly a minute. Then, in a voice that was his own, but carried an echo of the authority that had possessed him 3 days earlier, he said, 17 are safe. The crow brought them to the light. But 23 sleep now in the mountain's belly, and their silver dreams have turned to stone. This time, Samuel retained some memory of his words, though he couldn't explain why he had spoken them or what they meant. The specific numbers, 17 and 23, would prove to be accurate to the very last person, but no one in Pine Ridge would learn this for several agonizing hours. The hours following the distant collapse were filled with a terrible mixture of vindication and horror that left the Pine Ridge community reeling. Samuel's prophecy had been proven accurate in the most dramatic way possible, but the implications of that accuracy were too overwhelming for most people to process rationally. If the boy had truly foreseen the disaster, how many lives might have been saved if they had acted more decisively on his warning? And if he possessed such abilities, what did that mean for their understanding of faith, science, and the nature of human consciousness itself? The first concrete news came not from Silver Creek, but from an unexpected source. Around 4 o'clock that afternoon, a lone rider appeared on the mountain trail leading to Pine Ridge, moving at a speed that suggested either urgent news or mortal danger. The horseman proved to be Deputy Marshal Franklin Curtis from the territorial capital, who had been traveling to investigate reports of claim jumping in the Silver Creek area when the mine collapse occurred. Curtis brought news that confirmed everyone's worst fears. The Silver Creek mine had suffered a catastrophic collapse that had trapped dozens of workers underground. The main shaft and 2 secondary tunnels had caved in completely, burying the mine's central operations under thousands of tons of rock and debris. Rescue efforts were underway, but the extent of the damage made recovery of survivors unlikely. More importantly for Pine Ridge, Curtis reported that an old prospector named Willem Strauss had arrived at Silver Creek just before the collapse, with a warning about potential danger. Strauss had convinced the mine supervisors to evacuate 17 workers from the most dangerous sections of the mine, and these men had been safely above ground when the disaster struck. However, 23 other workers had been too deep in the tunnels to reach in time, and they were presumed dead. The deputy marshal's news hit the Pine Ridge community like a physical blow. Samuel's prophecy had been accurate, down to the exact numbers of survivors and casualties, a precision that seemed impossible for anyone to achieve through mere guesswork or environmental sensitivity. The boy had not only predicted the timing and nature of the disaster, but had somehow known the exact human cost it would exact. Curtis had come to Pine Ridge specifically to question Willem Strauss about his warning and its source, having learned from Silver Creek residents that the old prospector had come from the mountain settlement with advanced knowledge of the collapse. The deputy marshal's investigation would prove to be the first of many official inquiries into what had become known as the Pine Ridge Prophet case. Willem Strauss himself had not returned by nightfall, and his absence created another layer of anxiety for the already shaken community. Deputy Curtis reported that the old man had been injured in the collapse, not seriously, but enough to require medical attention and prevent him from making the dangerous return journey immediately. The deputy had promised to send word about Willem's condition as soon as possible, but communication between Silver Creek and Pine Ridge was difficult under the best circumstances. The implications of Willem's heroic journey began to sink in as the community processed the day's events. The old prospector had risked his life to deliver a warning based solely on a 9-year-old boy's vision, and that decision had saved 17 lives. Without Samuel's prophecy and Willem's courage to act on it, the death toll from the mine collapse would have been 40 instead of 23. The mathematical precision of Samuel's prediction had transformed him from a possibly disturbed child into something approaching a genuine prophet. But the confirmation of Samuel's abilities also brought new fears and questions that the community was ill-equipped to handle. If the boy could foresee mining disasters, what other tragedies might he predict? And perhaps more troubling, what if his visions showed events that couldn't be prevented, only witnessed? The weight of such knowledge seemed too heavy for a child to bear, and many residents began to worry about the psychological toll that prophetic abilities might exact on Samuel himself. Dr. Keller found himself in the unprecedented position of trying to provide medical explanations for phenomena that seemed to transcend normal human capabilities. His examination of Samuel after the mine collapse revealed some interesting physiological details. The boy's pulse and blood pressure had returned to normal levels after the collapse occurred, as if some internal tension had been released. His pupils were no longer dilated, and his previous restlessness had been replaced by a profound exhaustion that suggested his body had been under severe stress during the preceding days. More intriguingly, Samuel seemed to have retained more memory of his second prophetic episode than he had of the first. He could remember speaking about 17 and 23 people, though he couldn't explain why those numbers had seemed important or how he had known them. He also recalled feeling relieved after the earth shook, as if some burden had been lifted from his shoulders. The community's reaction to these developments was complex and often contradictory. Those who had initially supported Samuel found their faith in his abilities vindicated, but also discovered that having a genuine prophet in their midst was more unsettling than comforting. The weight of moral responsibility that came with access to prophetic knowledge was something none of them had anticipated or prepared for. Elder Blackwood and his faction, who had viewed Samuel as a spiritual threat, found their position complicated by the undeniable accuracy of his prophecy. They couldn't argue that the boy had been wrong or that his vision had been the product of delusion, but they also couldn't accept that God would choose to speak through a child of unclear origins who used what they believed to be heathen language. Their solution was to argue that Samuel's abilities came from dark sources, and that the community should be even more vigilant about protecting themselves from his influence. The women who had formed prayer circles to support Samuel found themselves elevated to new prominence as the people who had correctly identified his gift. But they also discovered that being right about Samuel's abilities brought its own burden of responsibility. If they had truly recognized divine revelation, why hadn't they done more to ensure that the warning reached Silver Creek more quickly? The knowledge that their hesitation might have cost lives weighed heavily on their consciences. Reverend Matthews faced perhaps the most difficult challenge of all. His theological training provided no clear guidance for dealing with prophecy that seemed genuine but came through channels that challenged traditional Presbyterian doctrine. The boy's use of what appeared to be Native American words during his visions raised questions about the source of his abilities that Matthews wasn't sure he wanted to answer. Was this divine revelation filtered through the boy's unusual background, or was it something else entirely? The Reverend spent long hours in prayer and study, trying to find biblical precedents for Samuel's situation. He found numerous examples of God speaking through unexpected messengers, but he also found warnings about false prophets and the dangers of accepting supernatural claims without careful discernment. The accuracy of Samuel's mind prediction made dismissal impossible, but acceptance carried implications that could reshape the community's entire understanding of faith and revelation. Thomas and Margaret Henderson found themselves at the center of attention in ways that made them deeply uncomfortable. Neighbors who had previously treated Samuel as just another child now looked at him with a mixture of awe and fear that clearly disturbed the boy. Visitors began arriving from other settlements, drawn by rumors of the prophet child and seeking their own supernatural guidance or simply satisfying their curiosity about the unusual case. The Hendersons also faced increasingly persistent questions about Samuel's origins and background. The boy's use of Native American words during his prophetic episodes had revived old rumors and suspicions about the circumstances of his adoption. Thomas found himself repeatedly questioned about exactly where and how he had found Samuel, with some questioners clearly hoping to uncover evidence of supernatural influences in the boy's past. Most troubling of all was Samuel's own reaction to his newfound status. The 9-year-old seemed to understand that something fundamental had changed in how people viewed him, and he didn't like the transformation. He became more withdrawn and anxious, often asking his adoptive parents if he had done something wrong to make people afraid of him. The weight of adult expectations and fears was clearly affecting a child who simply wanted to play with his friends and help his family without being treated as something supernatural or dangerous. As news of the Pine Ridge prophet spread beyond the immediate region, the community began to receive visits from people with various agendas. Some came seeking prophetic guidance for their own problems. Others arrived to investigate claims of fraud or deception. Still others hoped to exploit Samuel's abilities for financial gain or public notoriety. Each new arrival brought fresh complications and forced the Hendersons to become increasingly protective of their son's privacy and well-being. The pressure was building toward a crisis that would test not only Samuel's abilities, but also the community's capacity to handle the consequences of harboring a genuine prophet. The answer would come sooner than anyone expected, in the form of a visitor whose arrival would change everything once again. The crisis that would define Samuel Henderson's legacy arrived on Sunday, February 25th, exactly 1 week after his initial prophecy, in the person of Dr. Harrison Blake, a Denver physician whose interest in neurological disorders had been sparked by garbled reports of the prophet boy making their way through Colorado Territory's medical community. Dr. Blake was a man of science in the purest sense, someone who believed that every phenomenon, no matter how seemingly supernatural, could be explained through careful observation and rational analysis. His arrival in Pine Ridge represented a collision between faith and science that would leave no one unchanged. Dr. Blake had traveled to Pine Ridge with a bag full of primitive medical instruments and a head full of theories about epilepsy, hysteria, and the effects of high altitude on developing brains. He was particularly interested in cases where religious communities had attributed supernatural powers to individuals who might actually be suffering from undiagnosed neurological conditions. His preliminary research into Samuel's case had convinced him that he was dealing with either deliberate fraud or an interesting example of how brain disorders could manifest in ways that seemed prophetic to unsophisticated observers. The doctor's arrival coincided with the return of Willem Strauss, who had finally recovered sufficiently from his injuries to make the journey back to Pine Ridge. The old prospector brought with him a first-hand account of the mine collapse that provided disturbing new details about the accuracy of Samuel's prophecy. According to Willem, the boy's prediction had been correct not just in its timing and general nature, but in specific details that seemed impossible for anyone to have known in advance. Willem reported that Samuel's mention of "the crow brings light to the shadow places" had proven literally accurate. A dead crow had been found at the entrance to the mine's most dangerous tunnel, a section that hadn't been used in months, but was scheduled to be reopened on the day of the collapse. The tunnel's reopening had been part of an expansion plan that was known only to the mine's supervisors and a few senior workers, information that no one in Pine Ridge should have possessed. Even more unsettling was the accuracy of Samuel's phrase about silver running red with blood. The mine collapse had ruptured an underground stream that now flowed red with iron oxide through the ruins, creating exactly the visual described in the boy's prophecy. Willem had also confirmed that Samuel's use of Ute words during his vision had been authentic, phrases that meant "the mountain remembers" and "death sleeps in the deep places." Words that the old prospector recognized from his early mining days when he had worked alongside Native American guides. Dr. Blake listened to these accounts with the skeptical attention of a trained scientist, looking for inconsistencies or evidence of embellishment that might explain away the seemingly supernatural elements of Samuel's predictions. But the precision of the details and the credibility of the witnesses made dismissal increasingly difficult. He decided that a direct examination of the boy was necessary to determine whether Samuel was a genuine medical anomaly or simply a clever fraud, supported by a community invested in believing in miracles. The doctor's opportunity came during the Sunday morning service, when Samuel experienced another prophetic episode that was even more dramatic and specific than his previous visions. The church was packed beyond capacity with visitors who had come to witness the famous prophet child, creating an atmosphere of expectation and tension that seemed to affect everyone present. Samuel had seemed normal throughout the week following the mine collapse confirmation, showing no signs of the otherworldly presence that had possessed him during his prophecies. But as Reverend Matthews began his sermon, the boy once again stood up with that strange dignity and authority that transformed him before the congregation's eyes. This time, however, Samuel's words were different, more personal and more terrifying than his previous predictions. Instead of speaking about distant disasters, he began addressing individuals in the congregation directly, describing events from their private lives that he couldn't possibly have known through normal means. His voice carried the same otherworldly authority as before, but now it was focused with laser-like precision on the secrets and hidden shames of the people around him. "Mrs. Elizabeth Carmichael," Samuel said, his pale green eyes fixing on a middle-aged woman in the fourth pew. "The baby you lost last December was not taken by fever, as you told your neighbors. The child was born too early because of the medicines you took, the herbs you gathered in secret to prevent the birth. God sees your grief, but he also sees your guilt." Mrs. Carmichael's face went white as chalk, and she began to shake violently. The secret Samuel had revealed was one she had shared with no one, not even her husband. She had indeed used abortifacient herbs during her pregnancy, desperate to avoid having another child in their already struggling household. When the pregnancy ended in miscarriage, she had told everyone that fever had taken the baby, carrying her guilt alone for months. Samuel continued, turning his attention to a young man near the back of the church. "Peter Atwood, the gambling debts you have hidden from your family will bring violent men to this place within the fortnight. They seek not just money, but blood, and your shame will endanger innocent lives. The cards have marked you for death, and death follows you home." Peter Atwood, a 19-year-old who worked as a hunting guide for visiting prospectors, turned pale and began looking frantically around the church as if expecting armed men to burst through the doors. His gambling problem was known to his creditors in Silver Creek, but was a secret he had desperately kept from his family and community. The threat of violence was real. He owed money to people who had killed over smaller debts. But it was Samuel's words to Dr. Blake himself that created the most chilling moment of the entire episode. The boy turned his otherworldly gaze directly on the physician and spoke in a voice that seemed to carry echoes of ancient judgment. "Dr. Harrison Blake," Samuel said, each word falling like a stone into the absolute silence of the church. "You have come here seeking to explain away God's mysteries with your instruments and theories. But you carry your own darkness, Doctor. The patients in Denver who trusted you with their minds and souls. How many died under your experimental treatments? How many suffered because you valued knowledge more than healing? You seek to cage the eagle's flight, but some mysteries are meant to remain hidden. Beware the price of knowledge, Doctor, for the mountain sees all debts and demands payment in kind." "Doctor." Blake felt as if the boy's words had physically struck him. The reference to his experimental treatments was devastating in its accuracy. Blake had indeed been conducting unauthorized experiments on patients in Denver, testing theories about brain stimulation and neurological manipulation that had resulted in at least one death and several cases of permanent mental damage. These experiments were his most closely guarded secret, known only to him and carefully concealed from medical colleagues and authorities. But Samuel wasn't finished with his revelations. Turning back to address the entire congregation, he spoke about his own origins in terms that provided the most chilling revelations yet. "The child who speaks to you now was born in the shadow of the sacred mountain, in the place where the old spirits dwell," Samuel said, his voice taking on those same Ute inflections that had marked his previous prophecies. "The blood that flows in his veins carries the memory of the medicine workers, the seers who read the mountain's moods and spoke with the voices of the ancestors. But this gift comes with a terrible price. Each vision tears away a piece of the seer's soul, and the mountain grows hungry for more." Samuel then revealed details about his discovery that Thomas Henderson had never shared with anyone. He described hiding in the root cellar while his birth family was tortured and killed above him, spoke of the sacred ceremonies he had witnessed before the attack, and explained how the trauma had locked away his inherited abilities until stress and isolation had finally broken through the protective barriers his young mind had constructed. "The old ways remember," Samuel continued, his voice now carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate from the church walls themselves. "The mountain spirits speak through the child who was marked by blood and raised in the light of the Christian God. But the gift is borrowed, not given, and the debt grows larger with each use. Soon the mountain will call in its debts, and the price will be measured in more than silver and stone." The episode reached its climax when Samuel made a prediction that would prove to be his most accurate and most tragic. Looking directly at Dr. Blake, he spoke words that would haunt the physician for the rest of his life. The man of science seeks truth through suffering, but truth has its own appetite for pain. Before the moon grows dark again, Doctor, you will face a choice between knowledge and mercy. Choose carefully, for the mountain keeps careful accounts, and some debts can only be paid with one's own soul. Then, in a moment that no one present would ever forget, Samuel's expression changed from prophetic authority to childlike confusion and terror. For the first time, he seemed to retain some awareness of what had happened during his episode, and the weight of the revelations he had shared appeared to crush him. He began to weep, not the tears of a frustrated child, but the deep, soul-wrenching sobs of someone who had been forced to carry burdens too heavy for any human being, let alone a 9-year-old boy. The immediate aftermath of Samuel's most devastating prophetic episode created a crisis that threatened to tear the Pine Ridge community apart. The personal revelations he had shared during his vision had exposed secrets that several families had fought desperately to keep hidden, while his predictions about future dangers created an atmosphere of fear and paranoia that affected everyone in the settlement. Mrs. Carmichael's secret about her miscarriage became public knowledge overnight, leading to harsh judgment from some community members and awkward sympathy from others. Her husband, learning the truth about their lost child for the first time, struggled to reconcile his grief with his wife's deception. The couple's marriage would never fully recover from the revelation, and they would eventually leave Pine Ridge to start over in a place where their tragedy wasn't public knowledge. Peter Atwood's gambling debts proved to be every bit as dangerous as Samuel had predicted. Within 2 weeks of the prophecy, armed men from Silver Creek arrived in Pine Ridge looking for him, forcing the young man to flee into the mountains to avoid violence that might have endangered the entire community. He was never seen in Pine Ridge again, though rumors persisted for years about a hermit living in the high country who matched his description. But it was Dr. Blake's response to Samuel's revelations that would provide the most dramatic confirmation of the boy's prophetic abilities. Shaken by the accuracy of Samuel's knowledge about his secret experiments, the doctor became obsessed with understanding the neurological basis of the boy's gifts. He extended his stay in Pine Ridge indefinitely and began conducting increasingly invasive examinations of Samuel, despite the growing protests of the boy's adoptive parents. Blake's medical investigation revealed fascinating details about Samuel's condition. The boy showed signs of significant head trauma sustained during early childhood, consistent with the violent circumstances of his family's death. More intriguingly, his brain seemed to have developed unusual neural pathways that might account for his extraordinary sensitivity to environmental stimuli. Blake theorized that Samuel's prophetic abilities were the result of his brain's remarkable capacity to process subtle information about geological activity, human behavior, and environmental changes in ways that appeared supernatural, but were actually hyper-evolved survival mechanisms. The doctor's examination also revealed that Samuel's episodes were taking a severe physical toll. Each prophetic vision seemed to drain the boy's energy and leave him in a state of profound exhaustion that lasted for days. More troubling still were signs that the episodes were becoming more frequent and more intense, suggesting that Samuel's abilities might be spiraling beyond his control. Blake's growing obsession with Samuel's case led him to make increasingly desperate attempts to trigger prophetic episodes under controlled conditions. He subjected the boy to various forms of stress and stimulation, hoping to understand the mechanism that produced his visions. These experiments, conducted despite the protests of Thomas and Margaret Henderson, would prove to be the fulfillment of Samuel's prophecy about the doctor facing a choice between knowledge and mercy. The crisis came when Blake's experimental treatments triggered a prophetic episode that was unlike any Samuel had experienced before. Instead of specific predictions about future events, the boy began describing visions of his own death, images of himself lying still and cold while the doctors stood over him with instruments that had pushed too far into the mysteries of the human mind. Faced with clear evidence that his experiments were endangering Samuel's life, Dr. Blake was forced to confront the moral implications of his obsession with scientific knowledge. The boy's prophecy about choosing between knowledge and mercy had come true with devastating accuracy, and Blake realized that his pursuit of understanding had led him to the brink of destroying the very phenomenon he sought to explain. The doctor's final report, submitted to the Colorado Territorial Medical Association after he left Pine Ridge, concluded that Samuel Henderson represented a unique case of neurological adaptation to extreme trauma. Blake theorized that the boy's prophetic abilities were the result of brain damage combined with inherited knowledge from his Native American heritage, creating a form of consciousness that could process environmental information in ways that seemed supernatural but were actually the product of extraordinary neural development. However, Blake's report also contained warnings about the dangers of studying such phenomena too aggressively. He concluded that Samuel's abilities were inherently unstable, and that attempts to understand or control them might ultimately destroy both the gift and the person who possessed it. The doctor recommended that the boy be left alone to develop naturally, with medical intervention limited to supportive care rather than invasive investigation. Blake's predictions about the unsustainable nature of Samuel's abilities proved accurate. As the boy entered adolescence, his prophetic episodes became less frequent and less precise. By the time he reached his 15th birthday, the visions had stopped entirely, leaving him with only fragmentary memories of his time as Pine Ridge's reluctant prophet. The community itself struggled to return to normal after the revelations and disruptions caused by Samuel's prophecies. Some families, unable to bear the weight of exposed secrets or the fear of future revelations, left Pine Ridge to start over elsewhere. Others stayed but maintained an uncomfortable distance from the Henderson family, treating Samuel with a mixture of respect and fear that never entirely disappeared. Reverend Matthews found his own faith permanently changed by his encounters with Samuel's gift. While he never publicly declared the boy's visions to be genuine divine revelation, his sermons after 1867 showed a new humility about the limits of human understanding and the possibility that God might work through channels that challenged traditional religious doctrine. The Reverend's theological evolution would influence Pine Ridge Presbyterian Church for generations, creating a community that was more open to spiritual mysteries and less certain about the boundaries between natural and supernatural phenomena. Samuel himself grew up to become a quiet, thoughtful man who used his inherited sensitivity to natural phenomena in more practical ways. He became a respected surveyor and mapmaker, helping to chart the Colorado mountains with an accuracy that reflected his unusual ability to read the land's hidden features. He married Sarah Denton, whose brother had been one of the 17 miners saved by his prophecy, and they raised 3 children in a Pine Ridge that had learned to accept mysteries without demanding explanations. Samuel rarely spoke of his childhood experiences as a prophet, but those who knew him well said that he never entirely lost his sensitivity to the mountain's moods. He could still predict weather changes with uncanny accuracy and seemed to know instinctively when geological conditions were unstable. However, he used these abilities quietly and practically, helping his neighbors prepare for storms or avoid dangerous areas without ever claiming supernatural knowledge. The legacy of Samuel's prophetic abilities extended far beyond Pine Ridge itself. Word of the case spread throughout the Colorado Territory and beyond, attracting the attention of researchers, theologians, and curiosity seekers who saw in Samuel's story either proof of supernatural phenomena or evidence of how primitive communities could misinterpret natural abilities as miraculous gifts. Dr. Blake's reports on the case became required reading at several medical schools, where they were studied as examples of how extreme trauma could reshape human consciousness in unexpected ways. The case also influenced early research into what would later be called savant abilities and hypersensitivity disorders, contributing to a growing understanding of the brain's capacity for adaptation and unusual development. Religious scholars found in Samuel's story a complex example of how divine revelation might work through natural mechanisms, challenging both skeptics who dismissed all supernatural claims and believers who insisted that genuine miracles must defy natural explanation. The boy's use of Native American spiritual concepts during his Christian prophetic episodes became a subject of particular interest to theologians studying the intersection of different religious traditions. But perhaps the most lasting impact of Samuel Henderson's story was its effect on the Pine Ridge community itself. The experience of harboring a genuine prophet, with all the wonder and terror that entailed, left the settlement forever changed. Generations of Pine Ridge residents would grow up with a deep respect for mystery and an understanding that the boundary between natural and supernatural might be far thinner than most people imagined. The mine collapse that Samuel had predicted became a permanent reminder of the price of dismissing warnings, no matter how unlikely their source. The Silver Creek mine was never reopened, partly because of the extensive damage, but also because of a persistent belief among miners that the site had been cursed by the boy's prophecy. The ruins became a monument to the 23 men who had died there, and a reminder that some knowledge comes at too high a price to ignore. In the end, the mystery of Samuel Henderson's prophetic abilities raises questions that extend far beyond the specific circumstances of his case. How many other children throughout history have possessed similar gifts, only to have their warnings dismissed as imagination or madness? What combination of trauma, genetics, and environmental factors might create the kind of consciousness that seems to transcend normal human limitations? And perhaps most importantly, what responsibilities do communities bear when confronted with individuals who claim knowledge that seems impossible but proves to be true? The story of Samuel Henderson reminds us that the line between the natural and supernatural may be far more permeable than our scientific and religious institutions are comfortable acknowledging. Whether we choose to see divine intervention, evolutionary adaptation, or neurological anomaly in Samuel's abilities may say more about our own need for certainty than about the true nature of human consciousness and its hidden possibilities. This mystery shows us that truth often lies not in the easy answers we prefer, but in the uncomfortable questions that force us to confront the limits of our understanding. Samuel Henderson's story challenges us to remain open to possibilities that transcend our current knowledge while maintaining the critical thinking necessary to distinguish between genuine phenomena and wishful thinking. What do you think of Samuel Henderson's story? Do you believe his abilities were the result of brain trauma and environmental sensitivity, or do you think something more mysterious was at work in that isolated Colorado mountain community? Share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know what theories you have about how a 9-year-old boy could predict a mine collapse with such devastating accuracy. If you enjoyed this tale and want more stories that challenge everything you thought you knew about the world, subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and share this video with someone who loves unsolved mysteries. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and remember, the truth is often stranger than fiction. And sometimes the most unbelievable stories are the ones that actually happened.